Why don't we talk about that and other news of the day with our political panel joining us today. Labor MP Josh Burns is back from Melbourne. Welcome, Josh. And Liberal MP James Stephens joins us again from Adelaide. Welcome to both of you. Why don't we pick up on this question of energy? In fact, there are a couple of questions that arise from Fateh Birol's address. Josh Burns, to you first. This global energy crisis, he says we're in the first phase of it. The European winter that lies ahead could be worse. Without Russian gas, I guess, is the inference. Why won't that lead to extra coal being dug up and shipped out by Australia in the world's moment of need? And if it did, what would be wrong with meeting that need?
Well, good afternoon, Greg, and good afternoon, James, and good afternoon to everyone out there. I'd make a couple of points, Greg. First of all, that we absolutely need to have our own sovereign capability when it comes to manufacturing different parts of our energy supply chain. We have all of the raw ingredients in Australia, and we add very little of the value here. That's why we're going to be, that's why we committed to a multi-billion-dollar manufacturing program to try and stimulate advanced manufacturing in Australia. It's not good enough that Australia doesn't add any of the value of these products in Australia, and we want to turn that around, whether it be for solar panels or batteries or any of the other pieces of technology that we're going to need in order to transition our economy to a low emissions future. The other point to make, Greg, is that as we transition towards that cleaner energy, low emissions future, it's really important that we aren't relying on some of the foreign and international things that ricochet throughout the world, that we have our own domestic supply of energy. And we're seeing at the moment the price of gas caused by the Russian invasion of Ukraine having ripple effects all the way to Australia, and it's important that we protect our economy and our the Australian public from those sorts of price shocks by having our own domestic energy supply, and the cheapest and most abundant form of that is going to be renewable energy.
Sure, but just to be clear, Josh Burns, there are no current constraints on exports of either of those commodities, are there, by Australia, gas or coal? In other words, if the world wants more and the developers of that product here in Australia are able to sell more, that's exactly what will happen, isn't it?
Well, for the short term, coal is expected to peak demand over at least the next decade, and the countries that we sell the most thermal coal to, Japan and South Korea, have already said that they're moving towards net zero. So we need to be planning for the future. If global demands do shift away from it, then we need to be planning for what comes next. The Prime Minister spoke today at an energy conference where he was speaking about the potential of renewable energy exports. The Sun Cable project in the Northern Territory is one example where solar manufactured in Australia can be captured and is going to be exported to Singapore. This is going to be one of the biggest examples of exporting renewable energy. If we want to think about what are the exports of the future, we have to be thinking about low emission technology. That's where the demand's going to be. And Australia's in this amazing place where we can take real advantage of what that will mean for our economy and for jobs in Australia.
Yeah, James Stephens, what strikes you about some of the comments made by the Energy Agency chief today? Is it that Europe is going to be under a real energy crunch, or is it around that reliance, the breaking down of reliance on China, particularly with our renewable hardware?
Look, Greg, I think both are of equal concern. We seem to have a confluence of issues coming together all at once now. Some are supply side, some are demand issues as well. We've got wars in Europe. We've obviously got also the spectre of potentially a significant global downturn, potentially recession in some of our major trading partners. So these are all having different effects right in the here and now on our energy markets in Australia. Obviously, it's a very concerning period of time for our own generation capacity here in Australia. I'm from Adelaide, of course. We've got very high installed intermittent renewable energy already. In fact, we can provide at times 100% of our energy requirements in South Australia from purely renewable sources. But of course, when the wind's not blowing and or the sun's not shining, we have this problem where we need peak baseload generating capacity. In South Australia, we rely on gas. We have no coal left in South Australia, and yet we've got the same problems that other markets along the eastern seaboard are having with meeting generation and high prices. So even if states like New South Wales, Victoria and Queensland catch up to where South Australia's at when it comes to installed renewable generation, clearly we can see, based on what's happening here in South Australia, that's not going to alleviate these major costs when it comes to generating. So we need significant solutions to storage, to having dispatchable energy in our grid, and South Australia is a good example that purely installing more wind and solar won't solve problems of energy affordability.
Yeah, you're talking about the operations of the market there, I suppose, James. But to Josh's point about building a sovereign capability around the components, the renewable hardware, as you might call it, here in Australia, does that strike you as feasible given the market, the absolute market dominance of China at present? Do you think it's within Australia's grasp?
Oh, definitely. And it's an important warning that we've got to heed and respond to, because no one wants to rely on any other single nation to be producing 80%, maybe growing to 90-odd% of elements of the supply chain. And clearly we want to install more solar in this country. We want to be doing the same with wind, the same with hydrogen. And we do have the raw materials in this country, like we do with so many other possible advanced manufacturing pathways. And of course, we support having more of that manufacturing happening here onshore in Australia. We want to have sovereign capability. We don't want to have reliance on overseas supply chains where we have the ability to do it right here in our own backyard. And I completely agree. We absolutely do when it comes to things like solar panel construction and manufacture here in Australia.
All right, let's talk about some strategic matters again that sort of intersect with China. We've got the Pacific Islands Forum running. The Prime Minister will be there as of some time tomorrow. Josh Burns, we see Penny Wong late last week engaging in that conversation with her counterpart. From that flows 4 sets of demands, broadly described as be nice, I suppose, by China. How likely do you think that Australia can move from this first step to subsequent steps? There seems a lot of difficulties still lying ahead in that process.
Well, I think it's really important to say that diplomacy is always the best option, Greg, and to have these steps now, the second bilateral meeting between senior government, Australian government sources and Chinese counterparts, is really important to stabilise the relationship. I think that's absolutely in Australia's national interest, and I think it's in China's national interest to have these bilateral engagements where we are engaging directly with one another.
But does it help if they're briefing out to their state-owned media, or let's just call it Chinese media, for essentially demands that should be met if we're to progress?
Well, so as I said, diplomacy is really important, and speaking to each other is really important. Now, what's said in domestic political circumstances is sort of, a little bit separate. But I would make this point, is that Australia and the Prime Minister made clear that there's been no policy position changes by Australia. What we're really seeking to do is to stabilise the relationship and to ensure that there is, a move towards a more stable engagement with China. I think it's in our region's interest for Australia and China to be working in a more cooperative way and in a more stable way for our region. So that's the stages that we're up to. It's a slow process, Greg. It's a steady process. It's one that, there haven't been policy changes from our point of view, but we are seeking to create a prosperous and safe and stable region. And I think that means engaging diplomatically wherever we can.
Yeah, as it stands, James Stephens, we are always going to be, in this difficult bind between our security alliance with the US and our trade relationship with China. Around that, you have Richard Marles in Washington talking about enhancing the US alliance because we want to avoid what he calls catastrophic failure of deterrence. What does that phrase mean to you, or what does it evoke in your mind? It almost sounds like the sort of things that happen ahead of war.
Look, yes, that sort of language to me, particularly being given in the United States as part of a security dialogue, would be an indication, as to my interpretation, of making sure we're continuing to invest in our defence capability, both as a nation, but also with our partners, first and foremost amongst them the United States, to ensure that we secure security and peace in our region through from a position of strength, and I support that position. Frankly, I think we do need to be continuing to invest in the capability of the Australian Defence Force and in the alliances we've got. First amongst them, the United States, also through frameworks like AUKUS and the Quad, the Quadrilateral Dialogue with the United States, Japan, and India. That's very important to secure peace in the Indo-Pacific, and that secures our economic future as well, because of course a peaceful region with open skies and free navigation of the seas allows us to trade our goods, to export, and to have those warm relationships with all of the nations in our region, and to grow our economy and also have that security of prosperity in peace and freedom into the future.
But do we do those things, James, in full knowledge that there's likely to be, predictably, blowback from Beijing, which never takes kindly to these sorts of statements, particularly those that are made offshore on foreign visits?
Look, I don't think there's any alternative than to very clearly have a single unity of purpose on this issue, which the coalition supports the government in, always prioritising Australia's national interest and our national security, the defence of our nation and the defence of our interests, and making it clear that we will continue to properly invest in that security and the capability of our defence forces and in our alliance with the United States is absolutely central to the interests of Australia, our security future and our economic future. So there is absolutely no alternative but to have a unity of purpose on that, and I support the comments made by the Defence Minister.
Yeah, it does sound like there's not much difference, as I think your government, Josh Burns, has been making the point. No substantive difference at all with the change of government that's occurred here on those big strategic questions anyway.
Well, Greg, we supported AUKUS at the time. We did put conditions around the acquisition of nuclear submarines or nuclear-propelled submarines, but ultimately the United States' relationship with Australia has been crucial for our own stability in Australia, and having that beyond politics is really important. It's not in either the United States' interests or Australia's interest to be having relationships based on political fluctuations of the day. I think the Labor Party is absolutely committed to securing Australia's future and ensuring that Australians can live securely and freely, and I don't think that I think that the Liberal Party shares that ambition. Beyond that, Greg, I would make the point that the speech made by the Deputy Prime Minister was also emphasising Australia's role and proactive role in the region. The Pacific is our home. The Indo-Pacific is our region. We take our role as leaders in that region and as partners of choice in our region really seriously, and it means elevating our Pacific partners and working within our region to support them. And that doesn't happen unless we take climate change seriously. It doesn't happen unless we take their concerns around climate change seriously. And I think there's been a huge sigh of relief, and that's something that has changed between one government to the Morrison government to the Albanese government, is our position on climate change and how important that is, not just for our own security, but also for our region and our key partners in our region.
Well, let's run a ruler over that, I suppose, after the Prime Minister returns from Suva. Now, just finally, I don't know what sort of filters you MPs have as far as security is concerned over your mobile phones, but if you're anything like the rest of us, you will be inundated with scam SMS text messages. Now this initiative by the Communications and Media Authority that puts a code of conduct on the carriers. James, maybe to you first of all, sounds a bit overdue to me. You reckon it'll work?
I hope so, Greg. I think it is overdue, although to be fair, both sides of politics are always trying to play catch up at times with some of these scammers, and so we already had a regime in place to crack down particularly on voice calls. Of course, the criminals have just moved to text message platforms, so now we're chasing them to there, and we do need the telcos to be very much engaged and responsible for the way in which their platforms can be used to take advantage of the most vulnerable people in our society. And as a local MP, I'm sure Josh is the same, it's just awful hearing stories from constituents that come to see you who have had an experience where they've been scammed out of their hard-earned savings, and we've got to be on the side of the most vulnerable and consumers and protect them from these people that are trying to exploit them. So I think, unfortunately, it's not going to end the practice. There's more that's going to have to be done. Technology will change. Obviously, they'll move, if this is successful, and I hope it is, to other avenues to try and trick people into providing them with their financial details and and
Yeah,
steal
exactly.
their money. But this is a good start, and let's just keep it up and be ever vigilant.
Yeah, well, they prey not only on the gullible, but also the intelligent and informed apparently. Josh Burns, at pain of, I think it's $250,000 fines, the telcos would comply, do you expect?
I would certainly hope so, Greg. And these, as James was saying, these are people who, the people who often get scammed are the people who can least afford it. And it is really important that there is a layer of protection to support it. And I guess I would reiterate the really good advice given by the Minister for Communications, Michelle Rowland, earlier today, that if you are in doubt, if you receive a number that you don't recognise, you don't need to pick up the phone. And if you get an SMS from something that doesn't look right and is asking for your details or for you to give some money to it, and it's not a trusted source and it's not someone that you recognise, don't do it. If you're in doubt, don't pursue it. And that advice was given by the Minister for Communications, Michelle Rowland. I think it was really good advice, and I hope to see a real end to this really awful practice.
Sounds like pretty sound advice, and I see James Stephens nodding away there while you offered it. Josh Burns, James Stephens, thanks for joining us once again on Afternoon Briefing. We'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Greg.
Thanks, Greg.